Okay, welcome epidemiology students. This is Dr. Rewat Dionandan, and I'm recording this from an undisclosed location that you don't need to know about. Because I'm out of town, I decided to make this video for you about your next topic, which is agreement. Hopefully the technology works. We're about to find out. Let's begin, shall we? Okay, what is it about agreement that we care about? We care about whether two different judges or raters or viewers, or more than two, agree on whether or not something reaches a certain threshold, whether or not a contestant is good, whether or not a paper is adequate to enter into a study, that sort of thing. And we often need to measure the extent of agreement between raters or judges in epidemiology when we are deciding upon whether or not everyone agrees that a study enters a systematic review, for example. That's when it's most commonly used, in my opinion. And you may wish to use measurements of agreement in your project later this semester. You don't have to. Other people have in the past. We're about to find out how to do so. So there's an article on the website called Kappa by Vieira, and it's not required reading for the course, but it adds a certain dimension to this topic if you care to read about it. Okay, remember we talked briefly about reliability, and hopefully you covered reliability in your research methods class or in your stats class. Reliability is the extent to which a test or a study, we haven't done screening tests yet, we will in a couple of weeks, the extent to which they produce the same or very similar results every time they're administered. Okay, so we like to think in science that something is not good unless it is reproducible. So there are measurements of reliability that we tend to apply. One of them is the inter-rater reliability. So the inter-rater reliability is essentially how much different raters can be relied upon to render the same conclusion about something. So here is the formal definition: the variation in measurements when taken by different persons, but with the same methods or instruments. For example, let's say you're doing a study of people's blood pressures, and you have a sphygmomanometer, that device that measures blood pressure, and you're using it to measure the blood pressures of your research subjects. It's possible that different people have different techniques, and you want to determine whether or not the application of the same sphygmomanometer by different people renders different results. You can measure the extent to which there is strong inter-rater reliability between them, the extent to which the different people using the same device will get the same measurement. That's important for quality control of your study. We also called measurements of inter-rater reliability or agreement concordance. And that word concordance will pop up again when we talk about match studies. So again, inter-rater reliability is a measurement of the extent of agreement. It's a score of how much consensus or agreement there is among observers. Observers can be judges, they can be technicians, people using a sphygmomanometer or a device, people using the same instrument, and so forth. Here are some examples. Judges scoring a beauty pageant from 1 to 10 for the same contestant. Will they all agree that someone is beautiful? Probably not, right? So it's interesting to see the extent to which they can agree. Maybe several psychologists are looking at a PTSD scale, a post-traumatic stress disorder scale, to assess a patient. That's a very subjective, qualitative scale. We like to test how subjective that scale is by applying a measurement of concordance. Or different devices measuring body temperature on the same subject. Do they agree? We can determine a measurement to the extent to which they agree. Okay, how do we measure agreement? There are all kinds of different statistics or indicators available to us. There's something obviously called the inter-rater correlation coefficient. There's an inter-class correlation coefficient. There's a concordance correlation coefficient. The only two I want you to be aware of for this class are Kappa scores, Fleiss's Kappa and Cohen's Kappa. I will only show you how to compute Cohen's Kappa, but I want you to know when you would use Fleiss's Kappa, because Fleiss's Kappa is just a modification of Cohen's Kappa. So Cohen uses two raters, or two judges. So for example, two judges looking at a beauty pageant, or two devices measuring temperature on a patient, or two technicians using the same sphygmomanometer to measure blood pressure. Whereas Fleiss's Kappa can allow us to look at 3 or more judges. Okay, so kappa is considered to be a robust measurement more so than simple percent agreement. For example, you can simply say, well, we agree X% of the time. Out of 10 beauty contestants, the judges agreed that 6 were beautiful. 60% agreement. That's one way to measure agreement. But the beauty of kappa or other kinds of interclass correlation coefficients is that we also account for the extent to which there would be agreement simply by chance alone. Let me say that again. It's easy for us to measure the extent of agreement by looking at a simple percentage, but it's more difficult to account for the extent to which they agreed by chance alone. So how are we going to measure occurrence by chance alone? Let's go through Cohen's kappa first. So yes, this is Cohen the barbarian. Ha ha ha. Okay, cool. This is the formula for computing Cohen's kappa. This is K is a kappa, Greek letter kappa, and don't be scared off by this fancy terminology. This stands for the probability of A minus the probability of E divided by 1 minus the probability of E. So probability of A is the observed agreement, and probability of E is the probability that agreement is due to chance. Right? So observed is how much we see the judges agreeing, that percentage I talked about, and E here is the extent to which it was probably due to simple randomness. And that's the thing that we're going to compute. That's the harder thing to think about, and it's actually very easily done. This number here gives us a score from 0 to 1. I'll call it a ratio, and it is a ratio. And as we've talked about before in this class, ratios, the magic number is always 1. 1 means there is complete agreement. If these two are the same, there is complete agreement. If it's less than 1, then there's probably not a whole lot of agreement going on. So let's work out an example. Here we have 2 judges in a beauty contestant. Right? Our judges are Mr. Hasselhoff and Mr. Shatner, both exquisite judges of beauty in the world. And they're looking at 75 beauty contestants and determining, are they hot or not? Yes, they are sexist pigs. Let's put that aside for the moment and just use the data and move forward. Here are the data. This table sometimes confuses people, so let's go through it carefully. Over here, we have Hasselhoff's responses, vertically. Okay, he thinks that 45 were hot and 30 were not hot. Horizontally, we've got Shatner's responses. He thinks 44 were hot and 31 were not hot. So here, 41 they both thought were hot, and 27 they both agree were not hot. Here is where they disagree. Right? On 4 people, Hasselhoff thought were hot, but Shatner thought were not. 3 of them, Hasselhoff did not find particularly appealing, but Shatner thought were quite attractive. We call these the discordant pairs, and these are the concordant data. Concordance is when you agree, discordance is when you don't agree. Okay, so simply looking at these data on their face, we would say that 41 plus 27 divided by 75 would be the extent to which there is agreement. But now we need to compute how much of that has to do with chance alone. And here is the magic of tabular mathematics. So again, where they agree is going to be here on the concordant cells. 41 people, they both agree, are hot. 27 people, they both agree, are not hot. They disagree on the discordant cells. They agree on the concordant cells. Now, the magic of tabular mathematics tells us that if I want to know how many I would expect to be here, let's say in this first cell, I would simply multiply the marginals. The marginals are the totals at the end here, and divide that by the total squared for here and here. Let's see how that turns out. Okay, so the observed agreement again is going to be the total of the concordant cells. And to get a percentage, I divide that by the total number of people in the pageant. And that gives me 91% almost. So already they've got an extreme amount of agreement between them. 91% of the cases, they both agree are either hot or not hot. Now, the amount of chance that's implicit in that assumption is brought to us by the marginals. So again, to get the marginals for the expected amount of agreement for how many they think are hot, I take 45 multiplied by 44, which are the marginals again for this cell, and divided by 75 squared. I add to that 30 multiplied by 31, divided by 75 squared, for the expected amount of agreement in this cell, and I get 51.7%. So in other words, almost 91% of agreement is there amongst those they think are hot and those that think are not hot, but we think maybe almost 52% of that is due to chance. So what do I do with that information? I apply it to my Kappa formula. I plug in these numbers and I get 0.81. Okay, what does that mean? Remember that Kappa gives me a score of 0 to 1, and I said that closer to 1 means closer to perfect agreement. So right away we see 0.81 is pretty close to perfect agreement. But how do I interpret an actual number? There are lots of scales available. You can go online and look up all kinds of Kappa interpretation tables. I like this one. So this is the one we're going to use in this course, but be aware that there are other kinds of scales that people like to use. Everybody agrees, though, that 0 is bad and 1 means perfect agreement. So 0.81 is what we got for Hasselhoff and Shatner. That means that they're almost in perfect agreement over who is hot and who is not. Not bad. Okay, but what if there are more than 2 raters? What do we do then? Remember? What if there are more than 2 categories? What do we do then? For example, you can be ugly, meh, pretty hot, very hot, whatever. Okay? All these things are possible. Now, Kappa only allows us to determine complete agreement, not a Likert scale of agreement. There are some things we like to do. Sometimes we dichotomize the variables. Remember, that means we create 2 levels where before there are more than 2. For example, I could say anything that's pretty hot or above would be hot. Anything below that would be not. Okay? Entirely possible. Or I do something called a weighted Kappa. You can read more about that here, where I apply weights to the different levels of scoring. We're not going to do this in this class. Just be aware that these options exist. And again, if there are more than 2 raters, I will probably use Fleiss's Kappa. So this is your homework. Just compute Cohen's Kappa in both cases and interpret. And I will upload the answers to the website. That is all.